Hello, welcome to the fifth video in the Expert Skills Program Self-Study Block. This video will teach you about concept mapping. You will find that it is the most efficient use of study time for any student. Before we begin, remember that filling out the study guide during the video helps you get the most out of what you're viewing. In this quote, Hurst points out that students enter professional education thinking that the medical school is going to educate them, but he turns the thinking around to emphasize that the institution is really there to help them learn to educate themselves. An important part of this educating themselves is learning how to learn integratively. This quote is a perfect lead-in for this video because concept mapping is likely the most effective way for you to develop integrative learning skills. Just to clarify the role of the medical school, your tuition pays for faculty that provide courses of study that are structured and organized around the disciplines that are needed for clinical practice. To some extent, the faculty have an obligation to also provide a delivery of that information that helps you to learn it in the time available. But the misunderstanding that many students have is that a passing grade indicates that a student has been educated by the curriculum. I want to assure you that from my 43 years of experience in medical education, that this never happens. Instead, when a student becomes truly educated, they have done it for themselves by using the curriculum. This is what medical school requires and what students don't expect. Now, we're going to turn our attention to concept mapping. As you will see, this video is about managing time that is spent on learning. Let's first consider the different ways that you can define or explain what concept mapping is. This will illustrate what the goals are and how it can be better understood. First, concept mapping is a tool for organizing knowledge. Examples of other tools would be constructing tables, lists, drawing cartoons or caricatures, and even simple highlighting. This definition contains the key term organizing. This is the most important active learning activity during any study session. The teacher's organization is not enough. Unless you reorganize, you will just be memorizing the teacher's organization. Don't worry that you have to rewrite the textbook. We're only talking about more subtle reorganization, and this will be shown in the examples that follow. You may actually be doing this already and are just unaware of it. For example, if you paraphrase your notes in order to condense them down, you are reorganizing. Next, we can view concept mapping as a way of reading. They provide you the deepest, most effective reading possible. While this will take extra time during the first pass, you gain the time back several-fold by eliminating the need for rereading. In essence, the map becomes the reading. Again, this will become evident when we view the examples. Next, we can view concept mapping as an ultimate active learning method. Remember that the importance of active learning is engaging your frontal area in decision making, and maps require constant decision making based on deep reading. I have found that all students unconsciously tend to automate their learning when under pressure, especially time pressure, and their reading amounts to just looking at the material. This disengages your brain and wastes time. The goal is looking for. When you are learning actively, you are always looking for something. A concept map can be viewed as a living document. This is because your maps will grow as you learn. It will take a little practice at first to get used to planning in extra white space to keep expanding your maps. You can save your concept map of the heart from anatomy, for example, to use during physiology and then again during pathology and even microbiology and pharmacology, all of which cover aspects of the heart. A related metaphor to the living document is that concept maps are like Google Earth. I will refer to this more during the rules for mapping, but it reflects that each branch is like clicking on a Google map to zoom in on your view. The requirement for inspectional reading and attaching concepts into a map provides an ideal shifting of attention that not only benefits big picture learners, but it's ideal for the student who might be impaired by attention deficit disorder. The tendency for the intuitive student or the perceptive type student to be easily distracted will also produce a low time on task. All of these situations involving distractions are solved by the need to move back and forth from the reading into the map, constructing the map, and back to the reading. Now, once a map is complete, it represents your current understanding as a visual representation. The map shows your grasp of the terms that grouped together, your identification of important concepts, and your inclusion of all of the relevant details. All of these are in your map. Many linear learners, including faculty and residents, actually find it clearer than text and are almost amused by how much easier it is to understand. You will also find that your map will reveal gaps in your understanding. While it is convenient to refer to concept mapping as if it were a single method, you will find that it involves several different active learning strategies. Students often remark that while concept mapping looks interesting, it's not a method they want to use. But in reality, they are probably already using one or more of the methods that are incorporated into concept mapping. If you follow the directions for the ESP method here, included in this video, you will find that concept mapping is at least 6 strategies that are in common use. First, intuitive types use inspectional reading during their big picture learning. Their habit of diverting attention to each new and interesting concept they're learning causes them to jump around and even to jump out of their reading into other resources. They might stop a video to do a web search, or they might look and see if a concept also applies to something else they know about. This is an active learning habit of looking for. Second, sensing types use outlining to organize and condense notes down to something they can study for exams. This sense of structure gives them a sense of certainty about how to remember what they're learning. A third strategy that is very common with intuitive types is to paraphrase. Whether they are constructing a table or just making a list, they shorten everything as much as possible to reduce the amount of detail they're trying to learn. This activity very often produces better understanding and provides an advantage on the more difficult exam questions. Fourth, cluster construction is a way of grouping terms together. This can take the form of tables or lists, but in the main activity, it is putting terms together so that they are learned together. For example, making a table of the muscles in the shoulder allows a comparison of their origin and insertion, and even their innervation and blood supply. A fifth strategy is simple comparison, which is second nature to the intuitive type student. This will go beyond any comparisons given in lecture, and it is usually done to help create a big picture. This is one of the more important aspects for the sensing type because it breaks that habit of sticking with straightforward linear learning and allows the discovery of comparisons and similarities that provide cross-linking, which we'll emphasize cross-linking later. Sixth, verbalizing is usually done in small groups of friends that try to explain the notes to each other or used individually to explain the notes to an imaginary classmate. So if you view each of these strategies as a skill, then it's possible for each one to be developed and improved like any other skill. Now, before you learn how these learning strategies are used to make a concept map, let's look at the basic anatomy of a concept map. This slide shows the general features of a concept map. After you have constructed several maps of your own, and after you have seen many other maps constructed by others, you will find that they can be quite variable and innovative. It was a major breakthrough for me when I learned that SuccessTypes students needed reassurance that they were producing the correct maps. If you're a SuccessTypes learner, it's normal for you to want to be certain about whether you're doing it correctly. Your new normal now needs to be whether your connections are correct. If that's the case, then your map will usually contain all of the components shown in this slide. But if in your map they may be organized a little differently and still be correct. In other words, there can be a number of correct maps of the same lecture or chapter. In this map, you will see two different types of nodes or bubbles illustrated. The nodes themselves are concepts that are enclosed in a bubble. Many students get creative with the shapes of the bubbles by using special shapes to designate certain characteristics. Nodes that contain concepts are most often branches unless they lie at the tips of the branches. The branching denotes a hierarchy where the nodes below all belong to the main node. An example would be a country branch to show states in that country. Although it isn't shown in this illustration, some nodes can contain a simple list that needs to be memorized. I recommend that a list be put in a box instead of a bubble. The concept map gets its name more from the links that join nodes together. As you can see in this illustration, the links can contain descriptive text, such as verbs or other modifiers that add meaning to the link. You can also see that one of the links is different from the others in that it crosses over between two branches. This is called a crosslink, and it represents integrative knowledge. When students search for crosslinks, they are pushing their reading to a higher level. Also, another way to look at crosslinks is they represent the harder test questions. One more note about the hierarchy in a concept map. There is a direct correlation between branch points in a map and headings in an outline. In fact, this is such a handy correlation that you will see that we use creation of an overview outline in the first step in concept mapping. Over the years, I have seen students create all types of layouts for their maps, but they can usually be divided into either top-down or center-out. Neither is more correct than the other, but the top-down maps tend to be preferred by SuccessTypes. I would recommend that unless there's a compelling reason to use a map center-out, that top-down be used. This is because it doesn't really matter to intuitives which pattern they use, but if they use top-down, it lets them study with their SuccessTypes classmates more easily when comparing their maps. More about this later in the tips on using maps to study for exams. Now we can view the next three slides in succession to better see the hierarchy. If we take apart a concept map, we can see that each link would still be readable as a sentence. The separate facts on the slide are still correct, but they contain information at the very simplest level. The importance of facts is that they can be associated with other facts to produce meaning. The next slide shows the advantage to grouping these links into branches. If you learn to identify grouping terms in what you are learning, you will create a mental filing system that will save time on exams and contribute to faster thinking. This activity also provides a great opportunity to practice the organization of knowledge that I've mentioned throughout this video series. In other words, this is the first opportunity that you have to become a producer of your own knowledge by practicing the creation of branching points. However, your map can do more than just create a filing system. It can also cross-index that filing system. In the next slide, you can see an example of a cross-indexing called a cross-link between two branches. The addition of cross-links in general indicates a deeper level of reading called inspectional reading. In the case of the link shown here, the influence of genetics was found to be different. Once the node is added to the map, it can have additional information connected to explain the difference. Now, I want to remind you, this information is not necessarily presented linearly in the text. This is the kind of information that is found by jumping around. So this will retrain the mind of the sensing type student to be better able to pick up relationships and integration in what they're reading. It will take a little longer, but it's highly effective. The formation of crosslinks has the potential to be very creative and very individualized. It represents the part of your learning that helps you have your own big picture when you're thinking through a test question. It can also bring out insights between you and your classmates when you're comparing your maps. In general, finding crosslinks is a characteristic of self-directed learners. So with the general anatomy of a concept map in mind, let's look at the ESP method for concept map construction. You may find it surprising that the first step in mapping doesn't involve drawing nodes or links, but rather creating a list. This will achieve the goal of giving you an overview to estimate the amount of material that will be entered into the different parts of the map. It follows the admonition that if you don't know where you're going, any road will lead you there. In this case, the road you are seeking is to create a useful foundation for your map. Ironically, for a top-down map, the foundation will be at the top. For step 1, your list should include all of the major topic headings and subheadings that you can find. These would be normally the headings, the top-level headings in an outline. It is a relatively simple task at first, but as you gain experience and confidence, you can include any topic in the material that will help get the other topics organized. I recommend, however, at first you don't make up new topics, but just keep it simple and scan through the material and make your list directly from the material. Okay, in step 2 then, once the major concepts have been listed and you have formed an overview outline, you can begin arranging the most general concepts across the top of your map. Your spacing will improve with experience as you estimate the amount of material that will branch down from each major topic. The second level in the outline, if you choose to pull those terms out, will give you an even better view of how much space will be taken up. This will develop over time how much you start with at the top of your map. After you've entered these major concepts, you will have this visual sense then of your overall outline before you even fill it in. This second step actually has several steps within it. In many cases, the topics will be quite obvious since they can simply be composed of the headings in a book or in a set of slides. However, as you gain experience, you will find that you can group some of the subtopics. There is no right or wrong here in this grouping, but rather there is a matter of your own comfort in seeing the groupings. You should group terms in a way that is easiest for you to view at the beginning of your map. Try to imagine whether the map will be easy to study for an exam, because that is exactly what all students do with their maps. In fact, they will tell you that they don't look at their notes again once their maps are finished. One last thing before going to the next step. And that is to use any connecting verbs or modifiers that will increase your understanding of what the links mean. You can use this especially in your exam review. Now let's look at step 3. As you gain experience, you will begin to find ways of subdividing each topic by branching. This should feel more like your normal reading, except that now you are actively looking for what goes in your next in your map. The answer to the question, what goes next, is that it should be grouping terms. Grouping terms go next in your map. You will find that paragraphs can have more than one grouping terms, and that the rest of the material in the paragraph is represented by branches. For example, a paragraph on embryology might concern development in the 4th week and refer to the subtopics of development of the gut, the nervous system, and so forth. The grouping terms would be the tissues, and the details would be mapped by branching from the tissues. This is a good place to give a note of caution and encouragement. The caution is that many sensing types at first fill too many words in the nodes, and this creates larger nodes and makes them more difficult to read. This is just a reflection of their former method of reading to memorize details. My encouragement is to go ahead and use as many words as you need. Let your entries change at their own pace, and don't worry, because it will occur. Everyone has a built-in tendency to simplify their work effort. You will gradually condense down the contents of your nodes as you learn how to branch out their contents and paraphrase better. Remember, this is actual skill development, and skill development takes a little time. Just liken it to any athletics. No one starts out just because they've been shown how to do something highly skilled at it. It takes a while to develop. So, to summarize step 3, you should take one thing at a time. First, inspection and filling in nodes, then examining the contents of the nodes to subdivide. Now for the 4th and most difficult step, the identification of crosslinks. This step requires you to go back through the material to find any possible comparisons. This is not a natural step for most sensing types who read linearly and don't jump around. But it is this exact strategy that produces higher grades on tests. This is because your search for comparisons, whether they are similarities or differences, locates information that may not have been taught explicitly, but will likely appear in the more difficult exam questions. This process, when practiced routinely, builds your analytic abilities. There is also a note of caution to give with crosslinks. They may not be there at all. That is why this step is the most difficult. In most cases, you will find one or more crosslinks, but there will be times when you don't find any. In order to deal with this, I offer you 2 suggestions. First, try to do this step earlier when you're deciding on the major groupings at the top of your map. For example, if the reading is about diabetes and it becomes clear that both type 1 and type 2 are covered, then you can conclude that there will be some places where the 2 are compared and that will show up on the test. The last concept map example illustrates this. All you have to do is read for the details concerning how genetics influences diabetes to be able to add links to your map at the appropriate place. The second suggestion is to do this step later if you feel you're wasting your time spinning your wheels. Sometimes, if you just keep moving along, you'll come across something in a later topic that will trigger a comparison, and you can go back and look for it and try and find the crosslink then. So keep in mind, other than making your map more complete and useful, just simply looking for crosslinks is a good reading habit, whether or not you find them. And now it's time to talk about the last and most important step in concept mapping, talking your map. The last step in concept mapping is the review of the map by using it to create a lecture or a mini lecture. This should be done on a separate day from when you constructed the map so that your memory has had a chance to consolidate. At a minimum, you should review once per week, but it can be more often. The review consists of talking your map out loud to an imaginary or a real partner. I often joke to students that they can talk their map out to their pet cat. The point is that it has to be out loud. If you do not do this out loud and you take a shortcut and just imagine talking, the back of your brain will take a shortcut thinking that if you recognize it, you know it. Explaining something out loud is a moment of truth. Just ask any third-year clerk. If you find a link that you cannot put into words, then you have found something you need to go back and look up. But on the bright side, you won't have to reread everything, just the links you can't put into words. Catching errors this way not only makes the learning into more permanent synapses, but it creates a refinement in your map that makes them the ideal exam review. And that includes the final exam. It is this final step that makes all the difference in your final product and also in the development of your brain. Concept maps grow intelligent brains. Now, if you will keep these steps in mind, let's look at some examples of maps to see how the final product can look. The examples that follow show how flexible mapping can be. You can find more examples in the SuccessTypes book. The next slide shows an example of a top-down map. This concept map was produced by a first-year resident physician on the topic of seizures. As you can see, it was published in the JAMA September 2000 issue in an article describing how critical thinking in resident physicians could be measured. It illustrates several basic features of concept maps, but lacks one very important feature. There are no crosslinks. The first level can be easily located from the main headings in a text or lecture outline. In this map, the first level would be types, medications, and etiologies. Note that not all nodes at the first level extend down to equal lengths. This reflects the content taught and reveals that not all of the material in a lecture or reading assignment is covered at the same level of detail. It's not hard to imagine the map being extended and expanded as future learning occurs. And that is what is shown in the next slide. This concept map, published in the same article, was produced by a more advanced resident physician on the same topic of seizures. When compared to the previous slide, it shows increased learning. This resident has been not only through the same lecture on seizures 3 times, but has also had clinical experience to go with and enrich his or her concept map. It is highly cross-linked, and it also has different entries at the level 1 nodes. That shows you this student did not have to be bound by a book or by notes to construct a map that made sense to them, and yet the entire map is correct. This type of individualization of a map reflects the way this resident has learned the subject. This helps to make the point that multiple versions of maps on the same subject can be equally correct, and it is important to emphasize to sense types that it will be uncomfortable at first because they need certainty that their map is correct. The problem is that much of the decision making that goes into the construction of the map doesn't follow highly specific rules. The good news is that the frontal area of your cortex is engaged by making decisions to add links, and because the frontal area has its own set of thinking skills, these skills will improve over time and the discomfort is reduced. Intuitive types benefit from mapping in a different way. If you imagine, as you look at this map, how it started on a blank page and gradually fill in one link at a time, you can see the student shifting attention to the reading, or if going from memory, shifting to their own recall of their own memory, and then moving their attention back to the map. For an intuitive type, this increases their time on task by preventing their tendency to jump around too much. For the same reason, ADD students also benefit. Also, one more benefit for the intuitive types is that their weakness in remembering details is helped by hanging the details on the ends of the branches. Now, we will look at a series of maps that are center out in design. This concept map is from the SuccessTypes book, where it is described in more detail. In this case, the maps are restricted in size due to the space restrictions of a standard page. Thus, this first map represents an overview, in this case, of the rotator cuff in the anatomy of the upper extremity. This general overview helps you see the breadth of the topic of the upper extremity, where each node represents an area to be mapped in more detail. The expansion node will specify where the map will continue. As maps branch into subtopics, your teaching must involve decision-making to determine the grouping terms. As mentioned previously, it's a good idea to try and leave some white space for adding details later. For example, this map may be useful later for recording notes on musculoskeletal pathology. Also, make note of the indexing notes in the upper corner. This helps you retrieve your maps for later study. The next map expands the shoulder muscles by branching one more level down. While this step continues to subdivide the general topic of upper extremity, it is still not highly detailed, at least not for a medical school gross anatomy course. You may begin to get a sense of a Google Earth phenomenon as you zoom in on more detailed information. This is a major revelation to many sensing types by helping them discriminate between levels of complexity. At first, sensing types view every concept level, from main headings down to actual details, as a detail. So every level then is a detail with an equivalent value to be committed to memory. This is because they don't know how it will appear on an exam, so they want to be able to just simply recognize anything on an exam. But as we have emphasized, memorization bypasses decision making. That means it bypasses solid long-term memory. The next slide reveals that our maps are approaching the final details. Note that the rotator cuff involves more than the muscle contributions, so that each additional node attached to the rotator cuff node provides more complete information that is related or grouped together. And I just want to keep emphasizing that each node requires a decision about organization. The final details are shown next. This map shows the details for only one of the muscles of the rotator cuff, and you would expect to have a similar map for each muscle. One of the important things illustrated by this map is that you can add any level of detail into a map. Nothing needs to be left out if you choose not to. As a final note on this sequence of maps, it is worth emphasizing that students report a feeling of satisfaction and control when completing a map. both of these emotions contribute to long-term memory consolidation. Now, in the next slide, I have included a map that reveals some interesting aspects of how a beginning sensing type might see a lecture on tumor viruses. This concept map of RNA tumor viruses was donated by a sensing type microbiology professor. I wanted you to see that concept mapping is not just for students, but it can apply to any situation wherever you want to organize material in a way that can be more easily visualized. This professor believed that this map simplified his lecture and made it easier for his students to understand. Notice that the linear organization of the sensing type is clearly visible along with the lack of crosslinks. If you were asked to make this map more complete, you could place the branches involving an oncogene side by side instead of on the outside edges, and then be more able to easily cross-link them, or more clearly cross-link them, and compare them for similarities and differences. Doing this would allow a more in-depth comparison. Also, if you look closely, this professor used modifiers on his links to clarify the relationships. Next, I want to give you an easy-to-remember slogan to keep in mind as you're mapping: list, group, and compare. When you are engrossed in your study, you will naturally be giving your attention to what you're learning. Medical school amounts to a steady stream of new information that you have to process efficiently. One of the factors that will determine how efficient you actually are is your additional awareness of how you're processing. Maintaining this awareness requires energy, and your tendency will naturally be to ignore it and focus on the material. At that point, your efficiency will drop because your effectiveness will drop. So I have condensed the directions for mapping that we've just gone over into a short slogan: list, group, and compare. This takes very little energy to keep in mind. It's like an advertising slogan, and this helps you maintain peak effectiveness. Let's take each of these one step at a time as a way of reviewing the steps for concept mapping. The listing component reminds you that it is important to at first survey and avoid seeking details until the major grouping terms are identified. Physically recording these terms into a list to form an overview outline prepares your brain to think integratively as you proceed. This is a gain in efficiency because you're not continually at the mercy of the book or slides to explain to you what comes next. You are aggressively searching for it. Next, the grouping step is initiated by starting your map with the most general grouping terms so that there is space for expansion beneath. Again, you are efficient because your brain is making decisions on what things go together. This process continues and will likely account for most of your mapping time as you dig out the concepts that branch from a grouping term. Remember that, at this point, you're now reading the way you always have read, a paragraph at a time. If you're a sensing type, you will be using more energy at first in mapping, making decisions about where things go in your map, but the effect over days and weeks will be that this gets easier. Just compare this activity to bodybuilding. No one doubts that the bodybuilder will get stronger over time, and your brain responds to your mental exercise the same way. Once you've dug out all the details and entered them into your map at the tips of the branches, it's time to go back and compare the branches. You do this by looking up similarities and differences. In addition, you may also find cause and effect that can be documented in your map by making the link into an arrow. One node then would lead to the other as a cause and effect. This comparison step is one that is done naturally by intuitive types, and this is what gives them an edge initially on more difficult exam questions. So here it is. List, group, and compare. Keep it in mind and your mapping will get better and faster. Now, let's look at some of the barriers that will discourage concept mapping. Many students are reluctant to use concept mapping due to different perceptions. The first is the time needed to complete a map. You might feel that there's too much material to be covered in the time available, and slowing down to construct a map just doesn't seem possible. But you should know that reaching this conclusion is making a lot of assumptions. For one thing, you're assuming that covering the material by simply reading through it and making notes along the way will produce the type of learning that will prepare you for higher order questions on the exams. In other words, you have to ask what you mean by covering the material. What is actually happening when you concept map a chapter is that the extra time and energy that goes into constructing the map at first is paid back many times over when reviewing for exams. Now, to be clear, what's being paid back is time. The reviewing is much faster. Students who use the ESP method never study their notes again for this reason. Let me give you another example of how you'll recognize the efficiency of a concept map. If you're unable to complete a map during the week, and this happens all the time. So let's say you're unable to complete the map, you run out of time in the evening. When you get back to it on the weekend, you start right where you left off. This is because you've done the overview organization, and during sleep you've consolidated all of this into memory, and everything that is in the map up to this point is in long-term memory. On the other hand, if you only read the material, sitting and reading, trying to cover it faster, then you try to catch up on the weekend because you didn't finish that evening, you have to start all over. Nothing was consolidated. You're starting back at the beginning again. Inefficient. This is because simple reading just simply doesn't produce the consolidation. You think you're learning it because of that illusion of memory, but it doesn't last. There's nothing to consolidate. Okay, before leaving this barrier of time, I want to remind you of something I mentioned earlier. All of the feedback that I get from students who adopt concept mapping indicates that the process gets faster and faster and actually exceeds the amount of material covered by the old way of reading. They would tell you directly they would never go back to their old way because they don't have time. The reason for this is that reading gets deeper, and deep reading makes sense and contributes to consolidation. Okay, the next major barrier is one that I've mentioned several times, and that is learning style. If you're an intuitive type, you might think that since you already see the relationships through your natural way of reading, that you don't need to slow down and record them in a map. What you don't see is that as you map what is obvious to you now, you will discover more relationships that you didn't see at first. You will also gain an effective way of taming all those hard-to-memorize details by consolidating them into your memory, a hierarchy of branching. If you're a sensing type, I've been emphasizing that you will be worried at first that your maps are correct. This will become much less of a problem if you talk your maps out as I've described. It will help you adapt much faster if you can do this in a small group or with one other person. Their learning style won't matter as much as how well you adhere to giving reasons for how your map is organized. Reasons come from the front of your brain, and the front of your brain is the part that draws the concept maps. When you review with another person, you're hearing the thinking in the front of their brain, and you pick up on any advantages to be gained from that. The last major barrier that I have found is energy. Mapping makes you tired. This is because using the front of your brain makes you tired. Mapping is also a form of deliberate practice. When you're trying to build up your weakness, it can make you tired from the sheer effort, and it can sap your energy emotionally. Why do you think daydreaming exists? You daydream when you're tired of thinking, so you release your mind and you don't think. That's an example of the front of your brain perceiving the effort of work in learning. But the good news is that, like bodybuilding, you look back on a workout with a positive emotion that you used your time to change yourself. Now, it is time to finish this video lesson with some recommendations and some cautions. One of the most common misunderstandings at first is the idea that the magic is in the map. It isn't. The magic is in making the map. You must construct your own map. Otherwise, you will just be reading someone else's thinking. The sooner you can construct your map after a lecture or a conference, the better, because you will be more efficient with your recall and get more out of the time spent. Once you have your map, however, then it will be very useful to compare it to other maps. Then you're comparing your thinking and not just looking at it. Also, experiment with talking out loud about your map as you construct it. This is especially helpful for introverts who normally study quietly. If you're feeling overwhelmed by attempting a complete map at first while you're still learning the ropes, just limit your maps to 2 levels and then study your regular way. This has worked wonders for some students. The reason is that they develop the full map when they're ready. Until then, the 2-level map creates that habit of looking around to find the major grouping terms. This only takes 5 minutes for a 1-hour lecture. It isn't deep learning, but it's only one step away from it. Students report to me that after about a week of just doing the 2-level maps, they start to see more groupings, and so they go ahead and put them in their map. As they keep doing this, it gets easier and easier. Before long, they have completed a map, simply because they're seeing more and more. While this has been mentioned several times, it's so powerful that it's worth repeating. Whenever you can compare your maps with what others have constructed, you set your mind at ease about how maps can be different and still correct. You also come to understand why no map is complete, because you can always learn more that can expand your own map. The only thing that keeps it under control is the exam schedule. Sooner or later, you have to stop studying and take the exam. On the next slide, there are a few more recommendations and cautions. Remember that maps are living documents, so leave room for them to grow. As you learn in each course, you will find information that you can enter into earlier maps. All of your maps will be useful for Step 1 and for the clinical clerkships. You may not realize it now, but your clinical education also involves the basic sciences, and it will be easy to look things up in your maps. Now for a caution. Even though I've emphasized the capacity of a map to grow and include a lot of information, it is worth considering that maps also can be kept simple and exclude some information. Not every course tries to cover everything in depth, and your maps can adjust the same way. It has also been mentioned several times that students study their maps and not their notes. This can only work if you talk your map. This step allows you to verify that you really understand what it is, or what is in your map, and it also allows you to fine-tune or correct information as needed. Over the years, I've seen an amazing variety of individual customization of maps. Students use colors and shapes to designate and decorate. They use different media, including apps for tablets. Some use whiteboards with sticky notes as the nodes, and some use poster pads to construct larger maps. The take-home lesson here is that concept mapping is your tool that you can adapt to your own personality and individual needs. If you're going to use electronic media, think carefully about the time spent and how you draw the map. Some are keyboard mouse driven and some are stylus tablet driven. My experience is that something important is gained with the eye-to-hand feedback of drawing your map. But this is new territory, and it may work very well for some students to create their maps in a computer program. If that is the case, then the next slide offers a recommendation. Since a hand-drawn map is difficult to store electronically, especially on media that cannot be scanned or photographed, there are some advantages to storing maps in electronic form. The best software for achieving this is a free program, Cmap Tools, which is provided by the Institute for Human and Machine Computing, and their web address is given in the slide. It is very easy to use and is available in multiple formats, including iPad. I recommend that you try to construct your first version by hand and then convert it to electronic form. Repeating the map is not a waste of time, since repetition strengthens any memory you've already created. One variation might be to only convert a few selected maps to electronic form for the purpose of sharing or presenting. You can see a screenshot of the Cmap Tools layout in the next slide. This view of the Cmap Tools program shows the basic components of a main node and a branch forming a link. It shows the modifier in a field represented by question marks, which are replaced by what you type in there. If you want to create this, you can, or you can leave it blank. All nodes and modifier fields can be moved around by dragging with the mouse pointer, and the links retain their connection. Now, it's time to sum up what you should have learned in this video. Concept mapping orchestrates several active learning methods to maximize the return on investment in study time. It's a learning method that uses all areas of the brain by requiring inspectional reading and construction of your individual understanding of relationships. Thus, concept maps not only reflect understanding, they produce understanding. It is mindful learning, and mindful learning can only be conducted through deliberate practice. In the next video, we will cover the process of question analysis, both individually and in groups. I look forward to having you join me there.